And good afternoon, and welcome to today's WorldOregon webinar with a perennial popular presenter. It's a tongue twister there. You'll hear more about this great presenter here in just a minute. I first just want to welcome everyone as you stream in from the Zoom waiting room. We're thrilled to have everybody join us today, December 15th, for our last virtual program of 2022. It's been a great year working with you, and we're looking forward to more programming in 2023, which will include in-person and hybrid options, and we'll post a little bit about that in the chat. Reminder for those who may not have joined us in a while or for the first time that this is a Zoom webinar in which everyone is muted with their camera off, with the exception of WorldOregon staff and the presenter. You can post questions for the audience for the speaker in the Q&A. In the chat, we will post links to items of interest. For instance, just noting that it is an uncertain world we live in right now, and we are trying our best to produce really high quality programs for all of our audiences at low cost to you, or free in this case. And so we ask, as you consider the challenges that are buffeting a nonprofit world, to consider a donation to our end of year campaign. It would be wonderful for you to find a way, if you're not already a member, to look for a way to support us or our partner, the Oregon Historical Society. And I will post their link also in the chat. The Oregon Historical Society is a longtime partner of WorldOregon, and we're thrilled to partner on today's talk. He has done talks in virtual, in person. If you haven't heard him before, I highly recommend you check out our YouTube page, where we have our top hits for Christopher McKnight Nichols. And I'm going to post that in the chat as well. It was fun to see that today. One of his talks during the pandemic about 1919 pandemic has over 4,500 views. So quite a popular talk. Take a look at those. Again, we put these programs on free or low cost to you, but it's not a cost to us. We have other things that we have to take care of as a nonprofit, and we appreciate your support and your support for the Oregon Historical Society. And now, next year, as I was mentioning, we're thrilled to be restarting our Great Decisions program in person with a streaming option, coming to you starting in mid-January at Portland State University. I'm going to post in the chat the save the date, which my colleague Tim had up on our website about it returns in person. And again, it'll be at Portland State University, our great partner, with 8 talks on every Friday between mid-January and mid-March, both with an in-person option and a streaming option, with books available from the Foreign Policy Association. So we're looking forward. Stay tuned to more details on that. Tim's working hard to finalize those. Now for today's program. Today's program is one that I think will find quite interesting, especially those who might have gone to the Grand Strategy program we did with him before, and it's about ideology in U.S. foreign relations. Specifically, it's a book edited by our presenter and David Milne that is available through our partner at Broadway Books. And posting in the chat a link that if you are interested, you can order this book. And it's a great way to learn more about U.S. foreign policy and ideology in that. Christopher McKnight Nichols is a longtime partner who was previously at the Oregon version of OSU, Oregon State University, where he then was recruited away to the other great OSU, the Ohio State University, where he continues to be a professor working on history and looking at U.S. foreign policy. And true to his time in Oregon, continues to partner with us in the Oregon Historical Society. We're thrilled to have him here and in future programs. You know him, he's one of our best. I'm gonna pass it over to you. Thanks again for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for that warm welcome, Derek. Thank you to Tim DeRoche, the superb team at WorldOregon. To the generous co-presenters of this program, the Oregon Historical Society, Carrie Timchuk, Eliza Canty-Jones, and so many others. It's a real pleasure to be back with you. I'm not in Oregon, I'm in Ohio right now, but it's great to be with you. I just want to underscore the amazing work that WorldOregon does and the OHS does, and that they are very much deserving of our support. I'm still a member of both, even though I live far away. And I love the Great Decision series. I'm a veteran of attending those as well as presenting at them. So highly recommend it. I also want to just briefly say a shout out to my great co-editor and collaborator, University of East Anglia professor David Milne, who helped me co-edit the book that I'm talking about, and the great contributors who were involved. But most importantly, special thanks to you all for being here. Thank you for devoting your time and mental energy to caring about history. Helps us, how it helps us to better understand the present and perhaps to build a better future, and the ways in which ideas and foreign policy intersect. I'm really keen and excited to be presenting to you all today about a subject that's so close to my heart. My intellectual heart, that is. And one of the other things that I like to do, if you've heard some of my talks, is to connect place and people, especially as I'm now back with you remotely in Oregon, and we're all around the world. And one of the things that I like to do in doing that is the traditional land acknowledgement that's become, more common. I'm sure you all have heard these, right? And where I am in Columbus, Ohio, the land that Ohio State University occupies is the ancestral and contemporary territory of the Shawnee, the Potawatomi, the Delaware, the Miami, the Peoria, the Seneca, the Wyandot, the Ojibwe, and the Cherokee peoples. And specifically, this university resides on land ceded in the 1795 Treaty of Greenville and the forced removal of tribes through the Indian Removal Act of 1830 that many of us know a lot about and was particularly ignominious. But we want to honor the resiliency of those tribal nations and recognize the historical contexts that have and continue to affect the indigenous peoples of this land. And the reason that I say this to start out, one thing that I think is useful in thinking about ideology and foreign policy is that this land acknowledgement helps us to think a little bit together at the outset of this talk about the relationship between ideas, of places, and the ways in which ideologies shape how we understand the people's role, the people's positionality in a given place. And so the first chapter of the book, after the introduction that I co-wrote, with my great colleague David Milne, engages some of these questions. And so here's where I want to start us out, kind of in the middle of the story, in medias res, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about what I want to do for the rest of the talk. So, if you're thinking about indigenous peoples and the interactions of those groups with the landscape, with the U.S. government, with the colonial governments before there was a U.S., indigenous peoples, for instance, I think this is really important in my teaching and in my thinking about the subject, were paradoxically included and excluded very often. And a great example of this comes from Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall's infamous 1831 ruling in Cherokee Nation versus Georgia that described their legal status as one of, quote, domestic dependent nations. Now, this is something you all have probably heard before. If you know about this, it may jog a vague bell in your brain. Indigenous peoples were, in short, both the objects of diplomacy in this moment, as through foreign politics, and the subjects of government through their being colonized peoples. So it was not always thus, however. And what's interesting to think about when you think about ideology, foreign relations, domestic policy, and change over time, is that in fact, indigenous peoples' political membership in the British Empire was far from fixed. And that often they were placed as colonials on the same territory with colonials as those being colonized. In other words, they had the same basic footing as subjects of the British Crown. So if you look at English common law, if you look at the developing ideas about the relationship between indigenous peoples, colonials, and the state in the late 18th century, one of the things you find is a developing set of ideas actually about racial hierarchy, that it wasn't necessarily the case that the colonized would be below the colonizers in the eyes of the British Crown. So widening out our view then, since before the founding of the US, ideologies related to empire, subjecthood, and hierarchy of races and civilization have been critical to guiding national, colonial, and then US republic policies, the debates, and in shaping worldviews. It shaped how people thought of each other as well as how governments thought of each other. And that's really important. So I just wanted to start with that, thinking about place, about people, and about how this even precedes these kinds of shaping ideologies and ideas that build our worldviews and inform policies and politics, how they were there before the revolution. All right, I'm going to do three things in this talk. First, I'm going to begin with the recent history, because I bet a lot of you are interested in that. A little bit on ideology, shaping U.S. foreign relations in terms of post 9/11 U.S. Middle East policy, a little on Russia and Ukraine, a little on China and Asia, and use some great political cartoons to unpack some of that together. I'll present a few guiding questions, most notably on the peculiar presence and absence of ideology in American public life and politics. Second, I'll turn to issues of definition. And I don't want to bore you, I promise I won't, but we'll have to do a little bit about a definition. What do I mean by ideology? What have other people meant by it? What is it? What's the definition? What are the consequences of how you might define ideology or ideas? And then finally, third, briefly, I'm going to dive into some more of the history that I've started out with. I'll pick a few main themes and concepts from the book, gesture to a kind of capsule history of the role of ideas over time in shaping U.S. foreign relations. And then I want to jump into some conversation with you all, because that's one of the best things about this series. So as we do so often, you won't just see my head here on screen. I will share my screen and show some great images to help push us along in our collective discussion and in this webinar. So here we go. So here's my my contact info. If you want to drop me a note, if you buy the book, for instance, and would like a signed signature plate, just drop me an email, nichols872@osu.edu, or you can catch me on Twitter. Here's the book. Here's the cover. Just wanted to lay that out there. That's what we're talking about. That's where all of this comes from. And I stand on the shoulders of giants who've thought about these subjects in the past, and a number of the great contributors involved in the book. So I wanted us to jump right into the story, right into thinking about the recent past and some of the ways in which ideology has been at stake. In the heated 2008 Democratic primary, for instance, Barack Obama's national security advisor and advising team chose a kind of pithy formulation of what his foreign relations was supposed to do. It was to, quote, elevate pragmatism over ideology, as you see there. The idea, of course, of this tagline was that Obama as president wouldn't operate out of some fixed understanding of the world, but would rather be flexible, that he would have a foreign policy that was not based on theory or abstraction, but was really grounded in the real world. And of course, the sharp contrast here is to both Hillary Clinton and others in the Democratic Party who had voted for the Iraq War, and of course, to George Bush and the so-called Bush Doctrine, which came out of the National Security Strategy of 2002 of preemption, that the US for the first time articulated a vision that based on information, sufficient amount of information, and that was contestable, of course, the US could and should take action globally, including unilaterally, to stop attacks, to stop threats before they might reach American shores or even Americans abroad. So this elevation of pragmatism over ideology, of course, gets at this core sort of challenge. I call it the ideology problem in US foreign relations. The fact that so many policymakers and citizens alike reject ideology. They think ideology is problematic, or they say that, right? But the reality often is that ideologies are something that are unarticulated for us, are underexplored, that we don't have a lot of introspection about them. But very often when you look at the historical record, you find that ideology is present, that ideologies are shaping policy options and debates, guiding decisions and thinking. And so even in this context, right, the sort of what the Bush doctrine also was part of was what he called the freedom agenda, hoping to inspire through regime change in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, a wider democratic efflorescence around the world. And his argument there, he didn't like the term democracy promotion. He preferred freedom agenda. His argument there was that peoples around the world wanted freedom in the same sort of way that Americans do. Or as he put it in another speech, he argued, what do they hate? They hate our freedoms, about terrorists. And what Barack Obama was arguing was that, no, that's too universalizing, right? Freedom isn't the same for every person, every group, every religious faith, every region of the world. And that in fact, you had to take them on a case-by-case basis and be much more ad hoc, right? And so that's his argument of elevating pragmatism over ideology. All right, you already probably are a smart audience, one problem here, right? Pragmatism itself is a philosophical tool. It comes from William James and the pragmatists of the early 20th century, and is in fact a way of sorting out the so-called cash value, as James put it, of ideas. Now we could talk more about that, but this, I think, moment in the Obama administration, this elevation of pragmatism over ideology, is something that then shows us actually how we wound up in the world we're in today in some ways. So one challenge for the Obama administration was, of course, the so-called red line. You see again here some cartoons, right? You'll remember that he said famously in a press conference that the use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime in Syria against their foes would be a bridge too far. It would literally be a red line against which the U.S. Would measure then future actions and potentially a full-scale intervention. There was much criticism of this, as you all undoubtedly know. But just widening out to think about this moment for a second, sort of the mid 2000s into the 2010s, teens, one of the things you see here, one of the things that we get out of this is the fact that the Obama administration very much prioritized economic determinants. They very much prioritized not just hard power in the sense that the Russian military had nuclear weapons, but they actually thought the future was about who had market share, who had new R&D, in the sciences, what kinds of businesses were growing in different places. So what the Obama administration did in their pivot to Asia was, switching back, not against Russia, as you see there in the cartoon on the lower right, that by taking their eye off the ball, as you see in the upper left, the Bush administration had allowed the Russian regime to push back against the free press and to roll back certain democratic freedoms in Russia, just as the U.S. was expanding its advocacy for democracy around the world. So too, you see another pivot in the Obama administration towards China, towards Asia, thinking that the 21st century challenges for the U.S. would be economic, and fundamentally that a nation like Russia, so reliant on its military and fossil fuels, couldn't possibly be a major economic threat. So what did they miss? Well, one of the most obvious things is the ideological determinants of Russian foreign policy. We've seen that in how Vladimir Putin has talked about the kind of imperial Rus and taking over Ukraine. We've seen a sort of orientation to world change in that era, in the longer term of this era. That is the encroachment of the Russians against Crimea, which came as a shock against for the Obama administration, and they in fact couldn't do anything after the annexation of Crimea, or did very little fundamentally, ratcheting up sanctions, of course, and that this then informs the world we live in now. Now we could talk more about this sort of thinking about elevating pragmatism over ideology, thinking that economic determinants were most important. But another thing that it allowed out of the box was that Russian meddling ideologies in Europe have elevated far-right extremism, right, have helped to embolden regimes like the Orban regime in Hungary. And again, these were things that have meddled in elections across Europe, giving rise to more powerful far-right extremist parties, meddling in the 2016 election in the US, and on and on and on. And so what was being missed by the Obama administration, which is fascinating, and I didn't expect to find this in my studies, was fundamentally they missed the ideology of Russia. So the anti-ideological orientation of the Obama administration was itself, frankly, very ideological, privileging one set of values over another, but it also missed the ways in which ideology was operating for other countries. And that's a really profound lesson, I think, for policymakers and citizens alike. So I don't want to keep us moving. One of the things that this suggests to me, moving back 100 years, is the similarly profound ways in which ideology has operated for the US over time. Not consistent, far from static. But here's a political cartoon. I love these for picking out different kinds of orientations. Here you see Teddy Roosevelt aiming the Monroe Doctrine, this articulation of the U.S.'s sacrosanct right to meddle in the Western Hemisphere on its own, using that, and the caption reads, "Hands off. This in reality entails no new obligations upon us, for the Monroe Doctrine means precisely such a guarantee on our part," right? And they're aiming that at Europe, defending the Republic of Santo Domingo, and admonishing the crowns of Europe against making claims in the hemisphere. The so-called gunboat diplomacy of this era is a key part of this. Now, moving this forward slightly, actually backwards slightly temporally, here's another way of thinking. So that's looking at the Caribbean. How about let's look at the Pacific? Ideologies also functioned really importantly in how Americans thought about going abroad, and particularly about the opportunities presented in the Pacific and in the China market in particular. So here you see, and the caption reads, "And after all, the Philippines are only the stepping stone to China." So, in 1898, the U.S. annexes and holds the Philippines after a counterinsurgency war that lasts until 1902, 1903, until 1946. It takes until 1946 for the Philippines to become an independent nation after World War II. But the U.S. here is using it as a stepping stone, liking Manila Harbor, its deep water harbor, as a way to reach China in an era in which American economists talked a lot about a glut thesis that the U.S. was overproducing and underconsuming and needed new foreign markets. But here, what's important, what I want us to take from this is traveling with Uncle Sam, our steel rails, our education, our religion, right? Our mowing machines. You can look at this whole set of images, all the items that are coming with this, the trappings of modernity in the way that Americans thought about it, about civilization, about empire, right? About religion, about saving hearts and souls. About education, about English language, about modern sciences, and then you see this highly racialized version of people in China, welcoming in, wanting things like sewing machines, wanting, all sorts of things, clocks, and modern technologies, engines, cars, rails. You could go on and on seeing what this Judge cartoon circa 1900 has to say. So I just wanted to unpack for us for a second. This is the same sort of thing that you could think about. There were political cartoons like this, and thinking about a possible avaricious orientation of the U.S. to, say, Iraq and its oil, but nothing quite as dramatic as a moment like this or an image like this that shows how so many ideas, so many products, so many ways in which American foreign policy was manifested in ideological forms and in material drivers in thinking about China. So I want to then back us off and bring us towards that second part of what I'm doing the talk, the U.S.'s ideology problem. So that, as I sort of started out with thinking about ideology in the revolution, ideology in the period immediately following the revolution and its relationship to indigenous peoples, the U.S. was forged in the ideological fires of revolution. It should not surprise us then that ideology has been a really important factor in democratic debates and democratic politics and in foreign policy. One of the reasons for this that historians agree on, Michael Hunt, a great scholar of ideology and foreign relations himself, argued something along these lines, that it's a product of having a relatively stable political culture. And this might sound a little jarring at first, but if you think about other Western nations, other comparable nations, the US had relatively few significant revolutions, invasions, peaceful borders. It's had, not been occupied, no major society-shaking crises. You could argue the Civil War was one, but then it brought the nation back together, of course. But as a partial result, as I note here on the slide, right, no matter the relationship to that continuity, there's been a peculiar absence of self-consciousness of foreign policy ideology. You've often, in fact, seen it rejected in the way that Barack Obama did. It's been cast as a problem. And when I've done interviews about the book with journalists, they often say, well, what's the problem with ideology? Clearly there's a problem with ideology. And what I want to say, and the contributors in the book want to say, is not necessarily. No, there isn't always a problem with ideology. So let's think together a little bit about what that means, what that is. And as we do so, I'll give you a very brief sort of capsule overview of ideology. So roughly 1797 is when you see the first use of the term ideology. It comes from the French ideologues of the French Revolution, and they construed it as a science of thought. A science of thought aimed at constructing a system of ideas that reflected material reality. And this is one of the ways in which many scholars think about the subject. But 50 years later, Karl Marx offered an alternative formulation. The Marxian version was that ideology instead articulated the relationship between culture and political economy, that it provided a kind of essential mechanism, if you will, by which societies manage and reproduce themselves. In other words, ideologies are often not necessarily well understood by individuals within society, but that society's legal, political, religious, aesthetic, and philosophic forms ensure that members of different classes view their positions in their social system as natural. So this is like the opiate of the masses and religion. Ideology, in fact, functions to keep us all in our places in society, and in that way, and in some ways, it has significant masking effects. That in fact, it's somewhat of an illusion. Marx's varied positions on ideology almost always revolve around some kind of falsity, some kind of obfuscation, in which ideology legitimizes forms of hegemony and forms of capitalism. All right, so I won't go on and on. We could talk more about that if you want. But then one more thinker to consider is Louis Althusser. Louis Althusser was a French Marxist writing in the 20th century, and he slightly altered this formulation. He sort of brings into conversation the French ideologues and the Marxist take. And he argued, quote, human societies secrete ideology at the very element and atmosphere indispensable to their historical respiration in life. And when you find definitions of ideology, you often find metaphors of the corpus, of the body, the ways in which ideology functions in the heart, in the mind, but also in the heart, that it pumps blood through a system, that you need sort of circulating ideologies to function, and oftentimes you're not very aware of them, in fact. And so for Althusser, he emphasized the role of the state and of social institutions, which he called the apparatus, but didn't dispute that there was a kind of lived relationship to ideology. In other words, for him, it helps to, the apparatus of the state helps to reproduce ideologies, but there was something to a kind of lived reality. So it brings those in conversation. And many of the authors in the book, and myself included, see this sort of science of ideas meeting a kind of attention to language, which was something that Althusser was very interested in. And that's something that historians now, as you'll see as I go through the rest of the talk, are very concerned with. So here's some of the ways that I think about it. Here's some of the ways that historians today work on this subject, and political scientists as well. My final bullet point there, historian Michael Hunt has argued ideology is best understood as, quote, an interrelated set of convictions or assumptions that reduces the complexities of a particular slice of reality to easily comprehensible terms and suggests appropriate ways of dealing with that reality. All right, so I've given you a lot of definitions. What's the point here? They set the terms of engagement in foreign policy. They're not static, right? They evolve and change over time. They order and explain the world, and they project illusions that we can control what will happen, right? You have an ideology, you argue that the ends will be met through a particular means, and therefore some kind of assumption suggests that you can make that happen, that will happen in the world. Another thing that they do, if you think about, say, the freedom agenda of George Bush, as I noted earlier, or Teddy Roosevelt's corollary, 1904, 1905, from the political cartoon, right? They help to define and explain success and failure. You articulate an ideology, then it helps you to see whether or not you've been successful. And they justify and set boundaries. And I think really most important for our purposes in this conversation and thinking about the subject, ideologies are a big part of how we compel sacrifice, how we compel people to live and die for a cause, right? So, what is patriotism? What is nationalism, if not a core set of ideologies that push and promote people to sacrifice, to make war, to make peace, and also can justify inaction? So if you think about, some of the ways in which the Monroe Doctrine or other US doctrines and arguments wanted the US to stay out of foreign entanglements, for instance, you can see how ideologies also set the limits. They justify and set boundaries. And that's a really important element of thinking about this. So, all right, now I'm going to switch us to moving through. So how has ideology influenced US foreign relations? You want to get to the history, I want to get to the history. Here we go. How does the history of US foreign relations look different when seen through the lens of ideology? Well, thank you all so much, WorldOregon. Thank you, Oregon Historical Society. In 2019, I organized a conference. You can find some of the links on C-SPAN that included some panels there at the Oregon Historical Society with WorldOregon on ideology and US foreign relations. We gathered something like 25 scholars from around the world and asked them these questions. And debated and tried to figure out what sorts of answers made sense to these questions. And so I'll give you a little bit of that as we go now. One thing that emerged, as I was saying, is the importance of language, the importance of key terms and concepts. One that came out of our conversations that almost none of us expected to be shot through this history was civilization. We find concepts of civilization operating in the early republic, operating before the US Revolution, operating throughout the 19th century, into the 20th century and beyond. Civilization could be a justification for moving abroad, for intervention abroad, to civilizing mission, for instance, and at home in terms of indigenous people. But civilization could also be invoked foreign and domestic terms for change, for reform, for living up to America's democratic ideals. So civilization became a really crucial touch point in the book. And one of the chapters by a great scholar named Ben Coates argues in the chapter on civilization and American presidential rhetoric is that you see two basic forms of invocations of civilization by presidents. One is to preserve civilization, and the other is to advance it. And in both terms, both uses, it's very much about Anglo-Saxon civilization. And what you see in the 19th century into the 20th century is this transition, that you see a kind of project of expanding and preserving going hand in hand. And then in the 20th century, it's a project more of advancing civilization. But the civilization was imperiled before that. All right, so now I want to run us through quickly a little bit more, and then wrap it up. So I'll give you a few examples from the book on this great history. So, from the colonial era to the Monroe Doctrine to the Bretton Woods system after World War II, right? Foreign policies emerge from and produce ideologies out of necessity. This is something that we argue, that we historians find fundamental here. So the Monroe Doctrine of 1823 is a really good example. Issued by James Monroe, conceived in part by John Quincy Adams, who I'll talk a little bit more in a minute, and ostensibly designed to forestall European interventionism in the Western Hemisphere, as I said, and safeguard US regional interests. The doctrine really rose from and bequeathed powerful variants of things like imperialism, unilateralism, hegemonism, in a critical period of anti-colonial revolutions throughout the hemisphere, right? It's a crucial moment. And so you see in this moment, foreign policies emerging from and producing ideologies out of necessity. As the hemisphere is roiled with these revolutions, how will the US respond? What is the ideological orientation, and what new ideologies perhaps are bequeathed from that moment? Another great example of this is the dynamic of foreign policies emerging from and generating ideologies, powerfully confirmed by the case of the Bretton Woods system. And you all are probably familiar with this, so I'll just give you the outlines, right? Designed to help the world recover from the Second World War. The Bretton Woods system aimed to avoid the mistakes that the US and the world followed after the First World War, right? The US rejected the League of Nations, didn't join in that body, and did not have a US leadership role in those international organizations. So, avoiding that meant what one scholar has called enacting a, quote, New Deal for the world. And this creation of institutions such as the UN, the treaty is signed in San Francisco and housed in New York, the International Monetary Fund. These are very clearly ideological projections of power premised on US leadership, but also about structuring world order. And they have, if you go back to the definitional system, they're about core assumptions and principles, making a really complicated world more finite to then structure new policies. It's a great example in the Bretton Woods system. All right, so I'll give you something like 5 examples, and I'm out really quickly. And thank you so much for being a part of this. So, one of the scholars in the book, named Nick Guyot, a professor at Cambridge University, wrote a great chapter on John Quincy Adams' Empire and Civilization. And one of the fascinating things that he does in the chapter is he upends the notion that John Quincy Adams, who was Monroe's Secretary of State, right, and author of the Monroe Doctrine, a partial author of it, was an anti-imperialist and only an anti-imperialist. In fact, though he was greatly admired for his late abolitionism, during a lecture to the Massachusetts Historical Society in 1846, Adams declared that Great Britain had the, quote, righteous cause in its tawdry war with China over the opium trade, that in seeking to outlaw the trade of opium, British imports had addicted millions of Chinese people to that drug. Adams suggested that Chinese leaders were committing an, quote, enormous outrage on the rights of human nature. He aligned the US with the British in the Opium Wars. It's fascinating. And so what do you see here? You see an Anglo-American world aborning in the 1840s and 1850s, well before we tend to think of the special relationship between the two countries. There's antagonism through the end of the 19th century, but in fact, in John Quincy Adams's arguments, in these seemingly anti-imperialist camps, actually, the US was aligning with the British. And so Guyot in his chapter uses Adams's speech as a springboard to help us see American ideas about world order in the mid-19th century, and particularly in reference to Britain and the conception of international law, and that the US thought that it was more closely allied with the British than even those on the receiving end of the British Empire. So that's a great example of the way that ideology shaped and determined kinds of outcomes in policymakers. So here's another one that I think is a great example. There's a terrific chapter by Emily Conroy Crutz, who's a professor at Michigan State University. What she focuses on, and I love this, and I'm still thinking this through, and you could think through with me, I hope, generational differences. So for her, she focuses on a section of the Missionary Herald and a section of the ways that mission movements operated intended for young people, literally a section called For Young People. And what's fascinating about her arguments is that sort of in the late 19th century, the voice of American youth was important, and the ways in which missionaries sought to cultivate and then essentially indoctrinate mission youth into their projects has not been well studied, and is another way of understanding ideology. So if I was just at the high policymaker level talking about John Quincy Adams. Now here we are looking at things intended for kids, and so what she argues and explores is the measures missionaries took to ensure the next generation would take up the mantle of education and world evangelization, that they saw that as their mission. Each month, kids learned about the world in these sections for young people, appealing to the readers as children. The letters in this series were helping them think through how they could become adults. Now, what's the big takeaway here? Big takeaway here is the next generation of missionaries in the late 19th century, those kids with cross-cultural competency and language skills, many of them become the diplomats and the business leaders who give rise to the American century. Or what Henry Luce called the American century. They become the diplomats who serve in the FDR administration in China, in Japan. They are some of the most important figures in American foreign service. And they're the children who of missionaries or allied with missionaries, reading these kinds of tracts, looking at maps, trying to understand their place relative to other believers, other faiths, and this is important in thinking about civilization, perceiving their Anglo-Saxon Protestant faith as superior. right? So the inherent orientation to the world as one of Anglo-Saxonism, civilizational and religious superiority is deeply inflected in these writings, and then as in shaping the worldviews of people well before they know that they're subscribing to ideologies. And I think that's really important. How is ideology constructed for kids? And what does that mean for the worldviews that we have today? Because we often don't remember those things. And historians are well placed to look at the archives, look at the intent, look at the documents to give us a sense of that. All right, I'll give you a couple more examples and then we'll get to our conversation. So here's another one, jumping forward in time, one that we also don't tend to think about. It's a real contribution here. A scholar at the University of Iowa, Michaela Hoeneke-Moore, has a really remarkable chapter in the book and is producing some really fascinating work these days on grassroots ideology. So she's looking especially at GIs coming back from World War II, GIs and regular citizens in the 30s and the 40s. And one of the things that she finds is that though people in the foreign policy community often disdain the wider public, and we look at things like polls that suggest that Americans have no idea about geography around the world, or they don't have language skills, or they're proud to not have passports, things like that. The reality, when you look at the records of individuals, when you actually go to their memoirs and letters, is that many of them have much more robust foreign policy ideologies than we think, and they're often not what we expect. So what's fascinating in her work, as you see here, and I'll just quote her directly, is by going bottom up and looking at grassroots ideology, you find a diversity of foreign policy perspectives, that they really defy conventional binaries like isolationism versus internationalism, or elite or masses, hawks or doves, Republicans or Democrats, conservatives or liberals. And one of the things she finds is coming back from World War II, having fought and won the Second World War, a great many American GIs coming back did not want the US to have a global policing role, did not aspire to what we now know to be the US's deeply engaged base structures and military structures and diplomacy of the Cold War. All right, a couple last ones here. There's a great chapter here that I wanted to flag for you all because I think this is useful. This would be fun to talk about over dinner on national insecurity. Historian Andrew Preston at Cambridge writes about the fact that, especially starting after World War II, fear becomes a primary driver of US foreign policy and a particularly potent element in foreign policy rhetoric. As he says here, as I quote, an inordinate prevalence of fear that sits at the heart of the American worldview and provides the basis for thinking about US foreign policy. Even if the fear isn't functionally ideological itself, security regimes are shaped by ideological priorities and objectives, and our priorities and objectives are shaped by our fears. So one of the examples he starts with is, why were Americans more afraid of North Korean nuclear weapons a few years ago than, say, South Koreans? Why do Americans' peculiar fears in the early Cold War, for instance, why were they so much larger than the actual threat? How did policymakers and citizens have a kind of reciprocal relation by which fear became such a driver of American foreign relations for a country so very powerful and so fundamentally secure in so many ways? All right, a couple more and that's it. So another one I wanted to flag for you all that I think is really useful, and again would be good sort of conversation fodder for us to go now and to think about later, is about freedom. So Jeremy Surrey, who's a great historian at the University of Texas, he argues that the notion of freedom can be understood as an ideology itself. And he describes it as a, quote, base alcohol for Americans that changes over time, mixing well with certain additives in some moments and not with others, as I have up there. And he argues that there's sort of three key moments of freedom in or as ideology. So as he thinks about it, and this won't come as a surprise given what I've talked to before, the Monroe Doctrine is the classic example of a freedom from, that first one. Freedom from, in this case, European meddling in the Western Hemisphere. Now, Surrey dates the period of freedom to as being dominant in the late 19th century. Again, another thing that I foreshadowed earlier in the talk. When the U.S. economy was developing at breakneck speed, when the U.S. military was finally advancing to have close to peer status with other nations. And for him, Woodrow Wilson was the most influential advocate of bringing freedom to the rest of the world, according to him, right? Making the world safe for democracy, engaging for the first time in a European power contest in World War I. Now, the Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War marked a period when purposefully extending, quote unquote, freedom over to other nations became a major project for the US. Or as Jean-Jacques Rousseau would have phrased it, forcing them to see and to be free. And the benchmark for this, according to Surrey, was the essential task of US foreign policy embodied by the National Security Act of 1947. On this crucial moment of the new phase, when Americans self-consciously built a permanent military industrial complex to guard freedom on a global scale, at home and abroad. So that's freedom from, freedom to, and freedom over. Now, finally, this is a chapter that I wrote for the book, and I'll conclude with two big ideologies: unilateralism and exceptionalism. In US foreign policy terms, I argue the longest standing orientation and ideological foundation is unilateralism, acting alone, going it alone. It's deeply rooted. I have some quotes here, right? John Quincy Adams, going back to him, American happiness consists in independence disconnected from all European interests and power and European politics. Even Alexander Hamilton argued for this kind of orientation, securing the first Anglo-American treaty. Yes, sure, but also spurning the, quote, fatal heresy of a close alliance. And sort of this is a kind of counterpoint to the fears that Preston laid out, the pursuit of unilateralism. So in my view, unilateralism characterizes a kind of constellation of ideas about how US power should function, and fundamentally that this power should serve American interests single-mindedly, and that the nation should pursue those interests without constraints. This goes all the way back to the founding and helps explain, very recently, some of the popularity of ideas about America First, for instance. And I could talk more about this if you'd like, but one thing about the timing here, multilateralism was a term that was coined earlier than unilateralism. Multilateralism comes out of the World War II moment, and unilateralism emerges later. And I think that's a fascinating element, because the actual ideology, I would argue, is reversed. That unilateralism emerges in US foreign policy, in the colonial era, as the US thought about its best relationship to the world. And it's not until the, say, Wilsonian period that you wind up with robust arguments for multilateralism in US foreign policy. So final bit is exceptionalism. I'm saving this one for last. We hear it a lot, both sides of the aisle in the US. We've heard it for years, right? What is it? American exceptionalism is a great example of how we need to closely attend to ideology and ideas. Mission, providentialism, right? A kind of version, as this political cartoon notes, what is it? We're number one. And what does that mean? Hard to say, right? But the view as inherently different from other nations and explicitly or implicitly better or more positive is a huge part of how Americans have articulated ideas about exceptionalism. And exceptionalism itself has been crucial to understanding US projections of power abroad and within. So I started with indigenous peoples, and colonizing. It's a great example of American exceptionalism. And one of the things we found in the book is that in some cases, exceptionalism and empire have been synonyms, and at other times they've been thought of as alternatives. And the same has been true about capitalism and about democracy, that contested visions of democracy have been shot through with ideas about exceptionalism. So as I've sort of wrapped this up, I just want to suggest, if you think about some of the key concepts and terms over time, from the city on the hill of the 17th century, that's a kind of vision of exceptionalism, to the manifest destiny and westward expansion, of the early to mid 19th century. Manifest destiny, coined in 1845 by John O'Sullivan, to the positioning of the U.S. as the, quote, arsenal of democracy, FDR in World War II, up through Madeleine Albright's phrase that the U.S. had become an indispensable nation after World War II through the Cold War. These are all different versions and visions of exceptionalism. And I want to flag that for us as we think about that, because functionally what we see in the questions about ideology is a rethinking of the US's role in the world. It's not static, these ideologies, they're changing, they're developing, and they have profound shaping effects on our worldviews, from children to regular citizens to policymakers, men, women, children, all backgrounds. And so I'll leave it at that for now. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Thank you so much.
Chris, thank you so much. This is the disembodied voice of Tim DeRoche, the director of programs here at WorldOregon. I love that you said this would be fun to talk about over dinner. One of the things that I so appreciate about you is that you make history a social activity, and you make it not just a thing that happened, but a thing that is happening. you got into this a little bit, but I want to just expand a little bit on what you were just talking about. So some of these ideas, you mentioned, indispensable nation, the push me pull you of pragmatism and ideology, neoliberalism, realpolitik, containment. For the audience, what is and what isn't an ideology? And I'm asking, I'm thinking about us out here. I'm an armchair amateur globalist. How do I distinguish between the bumper sticker policy like America First and other more formal ideologies that have permeated our approaches to engagement? And how do we not get fooled by something masquerading as an ideology?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a multi-part question, which I really like, and I appreciate your enthusiasm for the dinner table conversation as well. So one of the ways that I like to think about the difference, say, between ideas and ideology is ideas are kind of constituent parts of an ideology. You might be, for a metaphor, you might think of them as building blocks or bricks in the edifice of the ideology. You need a core set of ideas to build up that ideology. So you can't have unilateralism without ideas about prioritizing, say, American values at home. You can't have unilateralist arguments that aren't located perhaps within isolationist traditions or vice versa. So in my definition of isolationism, for instance, I argue that there's two kinds: protectionist and political. And within that, I argue for a constellation of ideas. Two of the most important there are non-entanglement and unilateralism, actually. And the way that I think about that changing over time, this is a big picture, and then I'll get into the very specifics, but changing over time is that kind of constellation of ideas is like the firmament, that constellation of stars. At certain points historically, you can say, hey, this one is brighter. So if you think about America First, perhaps Donald Trump's arguments for America First were not very vigorously argued and robust, but the kind of core concepts in there that appeal to people, we can unpack. Things like self-sufficiency, things like bringing manufacturing jobs back to the U.S., border security, immigration controls, there's xenophobia written into that. And so some of those stars in that firmament are much brighter. They're more important to a, quote, America First foreign policy. Or let's look at it in the history that I've studied so much. America First Committee of 1940 to 41, their single biggest foreign policy priority was staying out of the war, World War II. They didn't endorse candidates. That was their singular goal. But within that, there were other ideas: building a fortress America, right? Not sending U.S. War material abroad, but keeping it at home so the U.S. could defend itself. So that's some of that. So those are ideas that build up to an ideology. How can you stop yourself from getting fooled? I think mentioned William James before, one of my favorite philosophers. One of the things that he says about key terms that are appealing, things like patriotism, is that he calls them, quote, specious abstractions. This is kind of what you're getting at, I think. And they're like empty vessels. They sound appealing, but when you actually open them up and get in there, what are the core ideas? What's going on? I think that's a little bit like the sort of some of the rhetoric about terms like America First, that get adapted over time, but also, patriotism, nationalism, they mean very radically different things to different people. You can have pacifist nationalists, for instance. You can have, anti-nationalist hawks. How can those two, go together or not? So there's elements there. The other thing I think that's important, you mentioned some of the big ones like containment. Containment as an ideology or as a grand strategy, is a big picture, long-term way of understanding the relationship between necessarily limited means and aspirational long-term ends. That's a definition for grand strategy. And so, if you're thinking about what is containment, how is it operationalized, it needs a whole core set of ideas underneath it. So you look to something like the 1950 National Security Strategy, NSC 68. And the argument there was to build up the military industrial complex, to substantially increase the U.S. military, to have the capacity to wage and win a war and therefore not need to fight it. A core set of assumptions, ideas, and principles that taken together become a grand strategy or a grand strategic ideology known as containment. I could go on, but I'll leave it at that.
Well, so we've got a couple questions coming in about the Biden administration.
Yeah.
I mean, some critics have said the Biden administration is handicapped by a foreign policy that is dominated by Obama administration players who got their feet wet during a post-Cold War that was kind of devoid of threats. And we're now in this funny post-Cold War world. What would you characterize the dominant ideology of the Biden administration being versus the conservative wing of Republicans?
Yeah. So if you think about coming into office, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, argued that the main foreign policy would be, quote, a foreign policy for the middle class, and that it would be a sort of U.S. oriented but international America is back set of foreign policies. So, making sure that the U.S. relationship to NATO or collective security is strong. We've seen that very much going hand in hand in terms of Ukraine, attempting to get back on board things like Iran nuclear deal, different kinds of economic partnerships. We could spin that out. America is back as a key phrase, but that's not exactly, that's back to a specious abstraction or piece of political rhetoric. It's attractive, like Build Back Better, but what does it mean? That's where we need to get to the ideas or ideologies. So I would characterize one piece of that dominant ideology as multilateralism, right? That the US is working with allies. It may be in a leadership role, or it may be in a co-partnership role. Here, thinking about climate change is a good example. But it is not in a unilateral mode, right? So if you contrast that immediately with the Trump administration, their unilateralism and their transactionalism, right? So looking for bilateral deals, trying to win bilateral deals, or attempting new kinds of resets like the summit with Kim Jong-un in North Korea, those didn't tend to work out very well, but that was a kind of ideology governing foreign relations. So that was more ad hoc, case by case, but as a whole, I think we could see a sort of through line there, that sort of unilateralism. The sharp contrast there is to what the Obama administration has claimed in terms of multilateralism. One thing that's interesting, even just in writing the introduction to the book, we got at the very last minute, the war in Ukraine was happening as we were putting this to press, we had to alter some things. And one of the things that I altered actually was my thinking about, the Biden administration has a unilateral through line as well. And one example there would be pulling out of Afghanistan. The U.S. did not tell its, allies very closely, right? And the Afghan regime fell arguably much faster than it needed to without the U.S. Being a better, fuller ally in that moment. And there was real human cost to that. And there have been a couple other examples on the border, for instance, where the U.S. has not been a full partner and player in terms of border control. It's certainly better, in my humble opinion, than the Trump administration was, but also pursuing fairly unilateral kinds of policies. So, another thing that we find in the book is that, when I'm saying they set the terms of engagement for nation states like the U.S., Ideologies do, and that they're deeply informative here of structuring those relations, they can also have competing elements. So you can have a small through line, say, of unilateralism in the Biden administration, and the dominant one being one of kind of multilateralism. And then within that, a sort of orientation or set of connections about, for instance, where I started, this view that it would be a foreign policy for the middle class, that it would be about bringing back jobs, bringing back prosperity, and that sort of thing.
Well, let's step back to Afghanistan for a minute. We've heard that many Afghan vets are upset about how the U.S. and the Biden administration pulled out so abruptly, leaving so many of our Afghan allies behind.
Yeah.
Does this impact and or fit into ideology compared to, for example, how GIs felt after World War II?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one thing that's interesting you see in the way that GIs wrote about their World War II experience is a transition really rapidly over time. Many coming back had fairly positive views of Russia as an ally in 1945. And by 1947, those views are significantly reshaped. That Russia as an ally helping win the war, especially in that terribly brutal Eastern Front, right? Far more casualties, 90% or something of combat fatalities happened in the Eastern Front. The American GIs were cognizant of that and hopeful that there would be, kind of an enduring peace afterwards. And just a few years later, the early Cold War, the fall of the rise of the Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill put it in Fulton, Missouri, that's the that alters their thinking. And so one of the things that you see from those GIs in the first few years after coming back from the war is them getting increasingly reluctant to be part of the next conflict, as I was noting. I think that's pretty commonly expressed from U.S. veterans of the Afghan and Iraq wars, that they're not especially keen to fight the next conflict. And one of the things that I think was interesting, though, when Russia attacked Ukraine, was that you did see those vets coming back and saying things like, I would like to fight in Ukraine. This seems like the kind of fight I wished I'd had, that kind of thing, which is interesting. The defense of democracy, it also embodies some of the other things that we see in the book, right? Racial hierarchy, Western civilization. Ukraine looks more like Americans. It looks more like what they aspire to, many Americans at least. And so has been an increased sympathy by vets and citizens alike, in the West. And the sharp contrast between how the U.S. has dealt with, say, the war in Yemen, or ongoing civil war in Sudan and elsewhere, right? That's an important comparison to how much the U.S. has supported the war in Ukraine. So I think those are components. I would add one other thing: most withdrawals, when there's still an active conflict, look unilateral. But the question is, are they, right? Have they been? But in both the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam and the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, the lack of informing allies and hanging them out to dry has been really a fairly horrific through line, right? And it's a real blot on U.S. foreign policy and military policy. And vets are right to point to that. These are the allies and translators and people who they fought with, who they trusted their lives with, and then they're pulled out. It's not up to them to leave or not leave. They're ordered to leave. It's really a tragic turn of events.
I've got a couple questions here I wanted to throw in, and this is a real simple one, I think, because we hear a lot of these terms, and it's sometimes hard to keep them straight. The pragmatism ideology. Can you explain briefly, because I want to get to a few more questions, the difference between ideology and worldview in foreign policy?
Yeah, I think so the ideologies are that kind of analytical tool that helps sort, as I said, the complex world into more finite pieces, that they're built on your core assumptions and principles, your values. And sometimes ideologies, in fact, are under or unarticulated or analyzed, right? And so, that's where the kind of Marxist framework actually makes some sense. We don't always know all of our own assumptions, right? We may be fooling ourselves in some ways. The worldview, my co-author, co-editor David Milne wrote a book called World Making about the worldviews of it's a great book of many of the most famous U.S. foreign policy thinkers and foreign policy thinkers and strategic thinkers, including Barack Obama. That's his last chapter. And one of the things he argues is that worldviews are sort of more capacious, right? And one of the things that the chapter on mission movements and for the young people suggests there is that part of kind of helping young people understand their place in the world is both ideological and worldview shaping. And the worldview can have many different ideologies within it. It's not a tool so much as a totality, right? The worldview is how I think about U.S. relations, not just with lots of other countries, but also as a worldview about the core principles and values that I've grown up with, my relationship to my partner, my thinking about my family, my local community. Worldview is sort of all encompassing in that way. And ideology is much more narrow. So multilateralism, exceptionalism, in some of the examples I was describing, freedom in different given moments, or potentially the role of fear and security structures and foreign policy. So I hope that helps. The worldviews essentially a much bigger, more capacious system that could actually involve many and even sometimes competing ideologies. Ideologies are a more finite tool than that, but ideologies are constructed of ideas. I hope that helps.
Sure. Everything old seems new again. We're seeing the sort of lust for empire in Russia, great power struggles, the US and China. We're kind of seeing this cover band return to Cold War, George Kennan era ideologies. And I'm kind of curious. Virtually every president since our founding was evangelical, almost missionary-like. And I'm so glad you introduced this idea at the end in spreading the American form of government beyond the borders of the US. Yet we're seeing liberal democracy weakening within our own borders and throughout the world. Can we regain our footing and trust globally so the megaphone we use is more aligned with a thoughtful ideology? And what qualities do you think are going to shape such an ideology in the coming decade?
Ooh, that's a big one. So one of the things we find in the historical record is that some of the most hotly contested ideological moments in US foreign relations have been about the kind of competing visions of democracy at home and abroad. And that's partly why I picked those political cartoons roughly 100 years apart, because you see this sort of world remaking role of a kind of freedom agenda, preemption doctrine of the Bush years, right, coming out of 9/11, is not that fundamentally unlike the kind of world making and reshaping of the late 19th, early 20th century as the US becomes a military and commercial power, wins the war with Spain in 1898, gets its first serious colonies outside of the hemisphere, and on and on. And one of the core elements of those debates is about democracy at home. I mean, this is a through line in almost all of my work, that domestic and foreign are connected. And your point is a really good one, Tim, which is that the foreign policy is fundamentally about the meaning of America. It's why it matters so much. And yet the meaning of America isn't fixed, and often we vigorously disagree. I mean, you think about what happened on January 6th. Now there are people on the farther right who joke about it, right? Who even suggest that if they'd done it, if they'd been more involved and done it better, it would have resulted in something very different. That's very troubling. And then there's other folks who think of it as treason, sedition, and the worst attack, basically since the foreign invasions and the British burning of the Capitol and taking of DC. One question I think that I have, and we've talked about this before in different moments, but I think the recent past precedents in US foreign policy suggest to the world community a lack of continuity. And I think foreign policy scholars, political scientists, historians like me, folks like you all who are interested in the subject, we probably all assumed a bit more foreign policy continuity over time, particularly with a bias to the 20th century, than was really there. So one of the things recent history has suggested is that norms and rules are actually quite different, and that American democracy's norms are quite fragile. And the same is true with foreign policy, that the Trump administration, for instance, could pivot so radically from the pledges of the Obama administration and multi-administration pledges, say, to NATO, for instance, including kind of fear-mongering about withdrawing from NATO, pursuing unilateral policies, tearing up deals, withdrawing kind of capriciously from other ones, ceding regional authority, autonomy to other nations. So thinking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership and letting China kind of run Asian economics to some extent. These are all huge kinds of questions and problems that other administrations, generally speaking, had held some more continuity in terms of foreign relations. And I think the challenge there, if you're thinking 10 years out, is if you're a foreign observer, why would you bet now on continuity in US foreign relations? And I don't think, as a sanguine thinker, you can bet on that, right? And so, therefore, what follows from that is that if American democracy looks shaky at home and you can't bet on democracy, you need to find different allies. So I think the US is a much more fragile place than it was 5, 10, 15 years ago, despite the fact that the US was embroiled in multiple forever wars in those years, had different kinds of problems, the crash, Great Recession of 2008-9, that kind of thing. I do think, though, to flip that and not be so pessimistic, if the US were to show that American democracy was more vibrant, if there were more protections for voting rights, if there are fewer election deniers, if some of the most extreme of American politics could be tamped down in some way, if perhaps the US could pursue some more seemingly rational on an international scale domestic politics, like preventing more mass murder, mass shootings, you might see more countries around the world thinking that they had shared values with American democracy, that the American democracy would be a good partner in different kinds of projects moving forward, even if they couldn't count on that consistency across administrations. I think that's the biggest challenge moving forward. And I don't know how the US fixes that, because I think foreign observers are correct to not necessarily trust multi-administration pledges.
Well, so I would be remiss if I did not bring up the 1918-1919 pandemic, as we, speaking of, greatest hits and cover bands, we love talking about that with you. But so are we seeing any, are there lessons, or are we seeing similar ideologies framing or shaping or driving our move out of this pandemic
Mhm.
to what we saw in 1919 and 1920?
Tim, that's a great question. It's one that I've been thinking a lot about. I will try to give a succinct answer. Several of the things that your common view about the 20s gets wrong is that the 20s were not unalloyed roaring moment in the global economy or in the US. So there's a downturn, right? A readjustment immediately following the war in 1918 and 19. That coincides with the pandemic. There's a period of extreme inflation in 1920, 21, one of the highest inflation moments in US economic history. There are a few cyclic ups and downs. Inequality, of course, as we all know and think about, sort of Gatsby-esque, that Gatsby-esque era is rising and rising. So that's not necessarily good about the economics, but as you think about them, what are the other elements at work? You saw in that era extreme immigration restrictionism and xenophobia, the rise of the Klan, the two or three of the most restrictive anti-immigration acts in US political history, culminating in the 1924 National Origins or Reed-Johnson Act, which reduced to a trickle until 1965 who could come into the US. You did see arms reduction, global arms reduction, and you saw, the U.S. engaging significantly in commercial and cultural terms around the world, and trying for kind of a public-private hybrid diplomacy rather than a kind of world leadership role. If you think about some of those ideologies, and Calvin Coolidge put it arguably best, and this is a nice little snippet, the business of America is business. And I think in some ways, Jake Sullivan meets Joe Biden vision of a kind of foreign policy for the middle class was all about, was hoping to get more jobs, higher incomes, more manufacturing at home. The problem of inflation now and questions of where the economy is headed is significant. On the other hand, you've seen a lot of job growth, but that's not how Americans have been perceiving it. If you went into the midterm elections, one of the things we saw was that Americans didn't feel like their economy was doing well, even if there were a lot of indicators other than inflation that suggested that. That was, coming out of the pandemic of 1918 and 19. People longed for quote unquote normalcy as well. I mean, sheesh, doesn't that sound familiar? That's very much the world we live in now. Increasing risks when you've got RSV, you've got flu, and you've got COVID all circulating. So those are some of the elements at work. I think what you don't see in the Biden administration that you saw in the Republican administrations of the 1920s is what they then argued for, which was was engaging with the world but not being committed to the world. So limiting commitments, like not being part of the League of Nations but having an observer on their major committees. Engage with the world commercially and culturally, but not diplomatically and militarily. That is not what you're seeing in this moment, right? The Biden administration is looking to create partnerships. There's these. And I see one of the comments and questions is about U.S. conversations in D.C. with African leaders, U.S. efforts at vaccine diplomacy around the world, in pandemic terms, U.S. efforts with NATO in terms of the Ukraine, and on and on. I think we could go. So you don't see that withdrawal from the world that in some ways was real and in some ways was imagined in the 1920s. The challenge is, of course, if you want to play out that set of parallels, and I think it's very imperfect, but if you do, it's hard to think of the 20s as anything other than a mix of good and bad elements that then led to far worse, right? From the Depression to unfolding global cataclysms that then ended up in the Second World War. So, God forbid that we travel along that path. My optimistic take there in our current moment, unlike 1918-19, is we have modern medical science, and we've had the fastest race in global history, in world history, in the history of science, to multiple functioning kinds of vaccines and other treatments. And, jury's still out on whether or not those will continue to be as effective with new mutations over time, but it's reasonable to assume that we'll be able to keep up with them. And that's totally different. So you saw, a fourth wave of the flu in 1919-20 killed more people than the first and the third in the U.S. We haven't seen, as terrible waves in the same sort of way, which has been which is good. But the U.S. has done incredibly poorly compared to peer nations in dealing with COVID, and I think that's another indicator. You look at what are the weaknesses of a nation state like the U.S. Poor public health communication, not being able to get people to rally around a cause. One of the things we've talked about before that I think is really important. The World War I moment dominated what happened with the pandemic. It's the best lens through which to view what happened in 1918 and 19. And one of the ways that the U.S. was able to get people behind a public health message was patriotism. Here's another sort of ideological construct. And within it, they embodied ideas about sacrifice for the greater good, that your individual rights should be circumscribed in order to keep others safe. And so, in that moment, you saw the image of the draft slacker, this argument that people who didn't serve, who didn't come out for the draft, were unpatriotic. That was morphed into this argument you saw a lot on the West Coast in late 1918 of mask slackers, people who didn't do their patriotic duty by masking. And so I think that's a really interesting thing to think about, that over 100 years, the US has kind of lost its ability to leverage a sort of patriotism towards community effort, towards, minimizing individualism and maximizing a collective best interest.
Wow, that is so much to chew on. Thanks so much. I'm just hoping, here we are. It's we're coming into the holiday season. That let's hope for an informed populace where the ideology is guided by kindness moving forward. And let's bring Derek back on to take us out into the day. Hey, Chris, always a great pleasure. And I'm looking forward to you coming back so we can have that conversation over dinner.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you all for being here too, and your great questions.
Yes, a huge thanks everyone for the questions. We ran a little over this because we had so many fantastic questions, and we knew we wanted to get those in. I really appreciate your time and expertise. I posted in the chat again a huge thank you to Oregon Historical Society, and asked those on the webinar, to consider making a donation to World Oregon and Oregon Historical Society to support our efforts to continue bringing programming like this to you in 2023. So Chris, happy holidays to our audience. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll look forward to having you again in the new year. Thanks so much.